My name is Bianca. I'm 43 years old, a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, my voice steadying despite the knot in my chest. I stood there, heart racing and chest tight, as my father's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words heavy with disapproval and disappointment, echoing in my mind long after he spoke. At 43, as a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, I had faced my share of challenges, but nothing prepared me for the sting of my father's rejection. Behind him, 200 Navy SEALs rose swiftly, their bodies a sea of camouflaged discipline, saluting with precision that made my heart swell with pride yet ache with a pang of loneliness. "The only easy day was yesterday," they shouted in unison, their voices a mix of honor and camaraderie that contrasted sharply with the confrontation I found myself in. I had spent years building my life around this family legacy, pushing through doubts and watching other women struggle for recognition in a male-dominated world. I'd earned my stripes in combat zones, faced enemy fire, and fought for the respect I had always craved, only to find it crumbling in the face of my father's disapproval. His stance, arms crossed, brows knitted, was no doubt fueled by the same protective instinct that made him a tough Marine. But I could feel the tension crackle in the air, suffocating and relentless, as his disappointment twisted my insides into knots. With every second that passed, I fought to steady my breathing, to drown out the tumult in my chest. It felt like being back on the battlefield, where each decision could either lead to victory or loss. I had never backed down from a fight, not in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, and certainly not here. But this was different. This was my father, the man whose approval I had yearned for my entire life. The man who had taught me that strength was not just found in muscle, but in will, courage, and a love that sometimes manifested as bitterness. "Dad, I'm not here to challenge you, I'm here to honor what we both love," I finally managed, my voice steadier than I felt. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had formed between us, but with every breath, I could feel the wall he had built. It was walls like his that made it so hard for women to break through in this world. I could no longer ignore the struggles I faced with my gender in a role so intricately tied to masculinity. In this moment, I wasn't just fighting for my honor, I was fighting for every woman who ever dared to step into boots too big for her. As the SEALs continued to stand at attention, I breathed deeply, seeking strength from their solidarity. "We belong here," I thought, but the words caught in my throat. I had spent so much of my life trying to be seen, yet here I was, still seeking validation from a man who didn't understand the weight of my journey. I steadied myself, a gunnery sergeant in a male-dominated military, knowing that every moment mattered. The tension hung thick, but it was also a reminder of the battles I'd already fought, an affirmation that I was not just a daughter in a man's shadow, but a leader among warriors. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the untold stories of military women, courage, sacrifice, and truth. Your support helps more voices like mine be heard. The air was thick with anticipation as the sun began to set, casting a faint golden hue over the assembled crowd. I stood at the back, my arms crossed, observing the formation of Navy SEALs in front of me. My heart raced with a mix of pride and trepidation as I felt the weight of my father's words echoing in my mind, "You shouldn't be here." It was the same line he had delivered with steely resolve when I told him I was enlisting nearly 2 decades ago. Yet here I was, a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, and standing among the finest operators in the military. His doubts hadn't dimmed my resolve, instead, they had fueled a relentless fire within me. The event was a memorial for a fallen hero, a tribute to someone whose bravery was etched in the hearts of those who served alongside him. As I scanned the faces of the SEALs, I saw a resilience that resonated with my own experiences in the field. Each of them was a reminder of the sacrifices we all made for our country, for our brothers and sisters. A knot formed in my stomach as I thought about the realities we faced, the dangers lurking just beyond the horizon, and the toll of our choices. In a world where life could change in an instant, I was reminded that we were not just soldiers but human beings with dreams, families, and desires to protect. My gaze drifted towards the podium, where the commanding officer prepared to speak. The solemnity of the occasion settled over me like a weighted blanket. I remembered the first time I had to inform a family about the death of one of their own. The disbelief in their eyes mirrored the pain in my heart. Moments like these were a part of my job, ones that you couldn't prepare for, no matter how many drills you ran or missions you completed. As I shifted my weight, grounding myself, I remembered the oath I took, the commitment to serve and protect, even when it meant standing in front of shattered families and broken dreams. When the commanding officer began to speak, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, I felt each word reverberate through my chest. The only easy day was yesterday, he reminded the troops. It was a motto I had lived by during my own grueling training and deployments. I noticed the nods of understanding among the SEALs, their expressions steady despite the heartache we were all feeling. They understood sacrifice, camaraderie, and the weight of duty. In that moment, I felt a deep connection to them, a realization that we were all part of something larger than ourselves. As the ceremony continued, my mind wandered back to my father's disapproval of my career choice. I wished he could see me now, not just as his little girl but as someone who had faced adversity head-on. I had built my own identity within a world often dominated by men, overcoming obstacles that would have made many back down. Standing here, my uniform crisp and my posture squared away, I felt a sense of belonging that had taken years to solidify. The pride swelling within me was bittersweet, threaded with the sorrow of loss, but it reminded me of why I had chosen this life. I wasn't just honoring those who had fallen, I was honoring myself and the journey that had brought me to this moment. I stood at the edge of the hangar, the scent of jet fuel mingling with the sharp tang of metallic tools and the faint, lingering smell of sweat. The vast cavern echoed with the hushed conversations and muffled footsteps of personnel preparing for another day of drills. I was supposed to be focused, I was supposed to be gearing up for the day's training exercise. Instead, my heart raced and I felt adrift in a sea of memories. It was the day Dad had uttered those words I never thought would haunt me, "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't the first time I'd faced disbelief about my place in the military, but that day had been particularly sharp. I can still hear the rustling of his uniform as he stepped forward, a mix of pride and disapproval etched on his features. He was a Marine, too, a decorated gunnery sergeant who'd seen more than his fair share of combat. I had wanted to show him that I could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best, that I could embody the strength and resilience he always praised. But there, in that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had, even as I stood tall in my boots. What struck me the hardest was the disbelief in his voice. It was as if he couldn't reconcile my dream with the reality he knew. His words cut deeper than any criticism I'd faced in training. "You shouldn't be here." Those words replayed in my mind. I felt like a ghost, hovering between my desire to serve and his frustration over what he saw as a deviation from tradition. It was a reminder that even in a world filled with women breaking barriers and shattering ceilings, the shadows of history can loom large, no matter how unyielding I tried to be. I stirred from my reverie as the sound of boots marching in unison filled the air, snapping me back into the present. Today's exercise was a joint op with Navy SEALs, their camaraderie evident in how they moved together, fluid and precise. I watched the way they rallied around their own, a testament to the brotherhood that ran deep within their ranks. I'd often found solace in the strength of my fellow service members, but a part of me could never shake off that moment with my dad. Those SEALs were commanding respect, worthy of admiration, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me, a legacy I was desperate to uphold and expand. The exercise commenced, the realization hitting me that today was a chance to prove my worth, not just to them, but to myself. The call and response echoed in my mind, a mantra I had carried with me since my own training days. The only easy day was yesterday. It felt like an oath, a promise that I was willing to fight against every prejudice, every "you shouldn't be here" I'd ever encountered. As I joined my unit, weaving through the ranks, the voices around me faded into a distant hum. I was no longer that girl standing on the precipice of doubt. I was a gunnery sergeant, forged in the flames of adversity, ready to make my mark, ready to belong. The weight of my dad's words still clung to the air like smoke from a fading campfire. "You shouldn't be here," he'd said that day. I could see it in his eyes, the disappointment flashing behind the facade of stoic resolve he wore like armor. It was a look I recognized all too well, one I had spent my entire life trying to break through. Even now, surrounded by the finest of the finest, 200 Navy SEALs standing at attention, saluting with a discipline I respected deeply, I felt the pull of my past, of family ties frayed but never fully severed. Growing up in a household where my father's expectations loomed large, I often felt caught between the desire to excel and his vision of who I should be. He wore his uniform with pride. It was a part of him that radiated strength. Every military family photo told the same story, a narrative about duty and honor. But there I was, a little girl in a world of boys, arms crossed, wrestling my own aspirations. I knew I wanted to wear a uniform too, but the path to that choice was littered with my father's apprehensions. Even as I enlisted, I held my breath, hoping he'd see my worth and let me prove him wrong. Training was a crucible that shaped everything I believed in. The sweat, the tears, the moments of vulnerability were essential. Surrounded by my fellow Marines, we forged bonds that transcended years of familial misunderstandings. In those grueling days, we learned not just to rely on each other but to lift one another up when doubt crept in. Still, every time I heard someone call their father sir with respect and admiration, it felt like another weight on my chest, a reminder of my father's unresolved expectations. I wanted to bridge that gap, to show him I was worthy of the uniform I wore, worthy of the honor we both cherished, but I also wanted to remain true to the woman I had become. The day I came home after my first deployment, I expected him to greet me with pride, but instead, he stood there, arms crossed, the same look in his eyes. My heart sank deeper into an ache I thought I could contain. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, but the words had changed. They were heavy with worry, cloaked in fear. I was not the little girl who needed his approval. I was a gunnery sergeant, seasoned by the fire of battle, yet all he saw was the risk. I had fought for my place in the Marine Corps, and it stung that he couldn't see I had already won that war. Even among the SEALs, who showed me a respect I craved from my father, I felt that relentless pull of familial conflict. As I looked around at the dignified service members standing in solidarity, I realized my journey was not just about gaining acceptance, it was about reconciling my identity with who my father wanted me to be. I had fought battles on foreign shores, but this unyielding quest for paternal approval was the hardest one yet. I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and opened my mouth, ready to speak. I wanted him to hear my truth, to recognize the honor in my choice, and to finally see me, not just as his daughter, but as the formidable Marine I had become. I had always been the kind of girl who thrived on challenges, but nothing could have prepared me for the day my dad looked at me and said, "You shouldn't be here." I could still see the disappointment etched across his face, the way his shoulders tensed as if my presence in that room was an affront to everything he believed in. My heart raced, not just with anger but with the overwhelming need to prove him wrong. I was not just his daughter, I was a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I was willing to fight for my place in a world he believed was too rough for me. The first time I was stationed on base, I felt the weight of my own expectations pressing down on me. I stood in formation, surrounded by a sea of soldiers clad in camouflaged uniforms, hardened by years of commitment. I could hear the whispers, some supportive, some doubtful, floating through the ranks like ghostly echoes. "What's she doing here?" they'd say. I often found myself running harder in the morning runs, pushing my body to its limits to drown out that voice in my head telling me I would never be enough. With each dropped bead of sweat and every burning muscle, I was determined to carve out my place, to show all of them that I belonged. In the weeks that followed, I was given my first real assignment, leading a small training unit in simulated combat scenarios. I can still remember that knot in my stomach as I looked over a group of fresh recruits who weren't much younger than me. They were strong, focused, and eager to learn, but the moment I stepped forward to introduce myself, I sensed their skepticism. The way they crossed their arms, like a protective barrier against my authority, made my stomach churn. There I was, standing before them, ready to instill discipline and strategy, but the biggest battle was within myself. Those first days felt like a blur of adrenaline and self-doubt. I pushed them hard, demanding respect while simultaneously wrestling with the fear of becoming an outsider in my own command. One day, I noticed one of the recruits, a young man with the build of a linebacker, struggling to keep pace during our run. My instincts kicked in, and I slowed down to run beside him, not to coddle but to share a piece of our mission, to show him that every one of us faced our own battles. In that moment, I was reminded of why I joined the Marines in the first place, not just to prove my worth to others but to inspire them to transcend their own limitations. At the end of that training session, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the recruits began to acknowledge my presence. There were nods, slight smiles, and even a few words of encouragement. It started small, but I could feel the tide shifting. When we lined up for formation, something remarkable happened. Just as the commanding officer called for attention, 200 Navy SEALs stood and saluted, sending an electric charge through the air. The weight of my dad's disapproval began to lift, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't realized I was desperately seeking: respect. That salute wasn't just for my rank, it was for the battles fought within, and in that moment, I understood that proving my worth was not just about showing strength but also about showing up, fully, fearlessly, and authentically. I remember the tightness in my chest as I stood in front of that imposing line of Navy SEALs. My dad's words echoed in my mind, a harsh reminder of the doubt he held about my place in the military. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice laced with a mix of concern and disappointment. I tightened my grip on the file in my hand, fighting the urge to turn around and walk away. I had spent years proving myself in a world dominated by men, and today was supposed to be my moment, the culmination of everything I had worked for. Instead, I felt like a child struggling to find her footing on a tightrope. As I approached the stage, my boots thudded rhythmically against the polished floor, each step a reminder of the grit it took to get here. I recalled the countless early mornings filled with grueling workouts, the late nights spent poring over manuals, preparing for every challenge thrown my way. But the biggest battles were often waged internally, battling against my own insecurities and the whispers of doubt from those who didn't believe I belonged. The SEALs lined up, impeccably straight, their presence overwhelming. I could feel their eyes on me, scrutinizing my every move, and I fought to keep my composure. I took a deep breath, envisioning the countless training exercises we had undertaken together, the camaraderie forged under fire. Just last month, I had led a group of Marines through a high-stakes operation that had tested our limits. We had emerged victorious, and I had felt a rush of pride as I watched my team work seamlessly under pressure. Right then, standing before an audience of elite Navy SEALs, I reminded myself of that victory. I was a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I had earned my place among these warriors through sweat, determination, and resilience. "The only easy day was yesterday," the commanding officer shouted, rallying the troops around us. The chant echoed in my ears, igniting a fire within. I squared my shoulders, my heart pounding in sync with the rhythm of the words. "Today is another challenge," I whispered to myself, clenching my fists at my sides. I wouldn't allow doubt to define my path. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, and suddenly, the weight of my father's disapproval felt like a distant memory. I was here to inspire as much as to be inspired. In that moment, as the SEALs stood and saluted, I felt a surge of acceptance that I had long yearned for. Their respect didn't erase my father's skepticism, but it overshadowed it with something far more profound, a recognition of my strength and capabilities. My journey wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about embracing who I had become and the challenges I had overcome. I returned their salute, a silent promise to continue pushing boundaries not just for myself, but for every girl who dared to dream of donning the uniform. Today wasn't just another day, it was a commitment to honor the sacrifices made by those before me, and to pave the way for those who would follow. The echo of my father's voice still lingers, a mixture of disbelief and concern that I hear clearer than I ever expected. "You shouldn't be here," he said, words heavy with fear. I often think back to that day, standing in front of him dressed in my service uniform, the insignia on my collar shining under the fluorescent lights of the recruiting office. I can still see the way his brow furrowed, the way his lips pressed tightly together as if he was trying to hold back an avalanche of worry. I was stepping into a world that many only dream about, the weight of his expectations colliding with my own relentless ambition, and it was hard to navigate the fear etched in his eyes while chasing my dreams. Every day since then has been a lesson in persistence, whether in the face of physical exhaustion during training or standing my ground in a male-dominated environment that often questioned my place. I remember each challenge not as a barrier but as a building block, adding to the foundation of my resolve. The arduous drills, the sleepless nights, and the relentless push to outperform my peers were all part of a pact I made with myself. I wouldn't just survive, I would thrive. I would not just wear my uniform, I would embody it, wear it proudly with every scar and every triumph lining my skin. I was determined to show not only my family but also myself that I belonged here, with the grit and the tenacity forged through years of hard work. As I rose through the ranks, the lessons extended beyond physical strength and stamina. I learned the value of camaraderie, understanding that we, the brothers and sisters in arms, were united by a shared purpose, even when facing the most daunting of tasks. I remember the first time I led a team during a training exercise. The daunting weight of responsibility pressed on me, but I didn't buckle. Instead, I leaned into it, drawing on every ounce of training I had received. Looking at the faces of my team, I saw a reflection of my own determination. In that moment, I realized that true growth isn't just about what I could achieve alone, it's about lifting others as I rise. The constant push and pull of mentoring, guiding, and sometimes being guided taught me that leadership is an evolving journey, filled with as many missteps as victories. The moment I stood on that stage, looking out at a sea of Navy SEALs who stood and saluted, I felt an overwhelming swell of pride wash over me. It wasn't just about the honor, it was the culmination of years of unyielding perseverance. Each salute whispered stories of resilience, of countless individuals fighting their own battles, echoing the same sentiment I had felt early on. The only easy day was yesterday, I knew the truth embedded in that mantra. Each day was a new challenge, a reminder that complacency could be the enemy. But it was also a reminder that growth lies in discomfort, that I would keep pushing because every step of the journey was building me into who I am today. So, when doubt rears its head, recalling my father's worried voice, I find solace in my memories. I remind myself that the path forged by unwavering persistence is often filled with more heart than ease. I have this role, this life, and every time I lace up my boots, I choose to honor that. I choose to grow. I choose to stand tall among those who strive for something greater, knowing that my presence is not just a testament to my strength but to a legacy of those who dared to dream beyond the confines of expectation. This is my story, one of relentless pursuit, defined not just by what I've endured, but by what I continue to overcome. The afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows of the barracks, casting sharp lines of light across the wooden floorboards. I stood there, staring at the framed photograph on my desk, the edges frayed from years of careless handling. It was a picture of my younger self, full of fire and ambition, donning my first set of dress blues. But standing beside me, vibrant and proud, was my little brother, Leo. He was grinning, throwing up a peace sign, that goofy smile of his lighting up the entire room. That smile had faded and turned into a memory, one that felt like a knife to my gut every time I looked at it. I could still hear him laughing, the sound echoing in my mind like a forgotten tune, always just out of reach. Leo enlisted just a year after I did, joining the Navy, eager to carve out his own path. I remember the day he called me after finishing boot camp. "Sis, you should have seen me. You taught me how to stand tall, and now I'm standing taller than ever." I could hear the pride laced in his voice, the passion that radiated through those words. I felt a thrill for him, a fierce pride that had always been the cornerstone of our bond. But then came the phone call that shattered everything. I was standing watch when my CO approached, his expression grave. "Get off duty, Sergeant. You need to take this call." My heart raced as I picked up the phone. They say you can feel a storm brewing before it hits, and that's how I felt when the words casualty and Leo echoed across the line. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and despair. I fought through mission briefs and equipment checks, each task becoming a mindless routine that numbed the heartbreak. They told me it was war, they told me these things happen. But the cluttered silence in my heart screamed that it shouldn't have been him. I had survived so much, faced challenges that would break lesser people, and yet so many moments made me feel powerless now. A single piece of grief can unravel the strongest soldier, and for me, Leo's absence unraveled everything I stood for. My determination transformed into a raw ache. The one person I thought would always stand beside me had been taken without warning. I threw myself into my work, drowning my sorrow beneath the weight of responsibilities. Leadership meant pushing through, but it also meant carrying the burdens of others, which made the emptiness within me swell even further. The late nights turned into early mornings, and somewhere in the chaos of training exercises and drills, I found fleeting moments of solace. But every time the sun dipped low, I felt Leo's absence, the void growing larger with every passing day. I began to understand that grief was not a singular, defined path but a labyrinth of heavy emotions, loneliness intertwining with duty. I was expected to lead, to nurture, and yet I found it hard to nurture myself. The 200 Navy SEALs standing in the sun, flawless in formation, brought me back to that moment of loss. When the command came to salute, I stood frozen, an anchor caught in the undercurrent of my own emotions. "You shouldn't be here," I heard my old instructor's voice echo, as if the words were directed at me rather than to the proud men in front of me. Those SEALs formed a brotherhood forged in fire and sacrifice, and here I stood, a solitary Marine unable to comprehend my own grief. In that moment, as they saluted their fallen brothers, I felt an overwhelming mix of honor, loss, and a burning desire to keep Leo's spirit alive. I was not just a gunnery sergeant for the Corps, I was a sister mourning a hero, and navigating the landscape of loss was a trial I would face every day. I stood rigid at the edge of the formation, heart racing as the sun cut through the early morning haze. All around me, an enormous crowd buzzed with energy, the air thick with anticipation and respect. My hands were clenched into fists at my sides, a habit I developed to channel the adrenaline coursing through me. I could see them, 200 Navy SEALs, some of the most elite warriors in the world, standing before me. There were a few familiar faces within the ranks, their gear and sharp lines etched into my memory like battle scars. I never thought I'd find myself in this position, but the weeks of preparation and training pushed reality into focus. I was being recognized for my work, and it felt surreal. "Bianca, you shouldn't be here," my father once told me during a phone call that still echoed in my mind. He couldn't understand why I had chosen this path, why I traded the comforts of civilian life for the raw grit of military service. His words had stung then, like cold water splashing across my face, but I never backed down. Standing here now made it clear, I belonged. The SEALs may have their code, but my experiences in the Corps had forged a bond that transcended the titles on our uniforms. I drew in a breath, letting it settle deep within me, reminding myself of why I was here. The moment the commanding officer called my name, it felt like the world had narrowed to just me and the ground beneath my feet. As I stepped forward, I kept my chin up, pride filling the air around me like the scent of gunpowder. I felt the weight of eyes on my back, some filled with admiration, others with skepticism. I recalled days spent training alongside diverse units, breaking down barriers that had held us apart. The recognition wasn't just mine, it was a collective acknowledgement of all the women and men who had trusted me to carry the banner of courage, tenacity, and grit forward. The salute from each SEAL hit me like a wave crashing onto the shore, an unexpected embrace that filled the cracks in my armor. It was a moment steeped in honor, but it also carried the weight of expectation. In a single gesture, they acknowledged the shared victories and silent struggles, what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to push beyond the limits of our bodies and minds. I could feel the pride and valor echoing in their stance, and I knew it wasn't just about me. This recognition was for every Marine, every soldier, every warrior who had fought tooth and nail for their place in this brotherhood. As the ceremony concluded, I turned to face my fellow Marines, eyes gleaming with a mix of joy and determination. Recognition from such esteemed peers didn't just bolster my resolve, it fortified my commitment to all those I served alongside. I could feel the unspoken promises pass between us. We were in this together, bound by shared responsibilities and dreams. In that moment, beneath the weight of the medals and accolades, I remembered why my father's words, though hurtful, had never broken me. Instead, they had fueled a fire that now burned brighter, an undeniable testament that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I stared at the shadows that stretched across the old hangar floor, the weight of years of history pressing down on me like the air before a storm. My father had always liked to remind me that I shouldn't have chosen this life. Too rough for a girl, he'd say, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw a tight line. It stung, even now, as I felt the adrenaline coursing through me, mingling with the ghosts of his disapproval. The last time we spoke had been after my deployment, the bitterness still fresh in my mind. I'd come home with more than just scars, I'd come home with pride, and yet there he was, standing at the edge of my resolve. As the Navy SEALs filed in, I felt a surge of admiration for these men, trained to face the impossible day in and day out. Each one of them moved with purpose, a silent energy radiating between us. I had trained alongside them during joint operations, seen their grit and resilience, and somehow, a part of me sought their respect even more than my father's. When the doors swung open, I felt a flicker of doubt. This was my moment, yes, but did I still have to prove myself after all these years? Would my father's voice echo in my head, reminding me that I was nothing more than a girl trying to keep up? "Bianca, you shouldn't be here," he said again, his voice gruff and low, cutting through the camaraderie like a knife. The room quieted, tension thickening. My heart rattled in my chest, a mix of defiance and hurt simmering beneath the surface. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay steady. "This is no place for you." I could feel the eyes of the SEALs on me, measuring, weighing my worth. I wanted to step forward, to show my father that my choice had been deliberate and brave, but instead, I felt anchored to the ground, trapped under the weight of his words. "Sir," I said, my voice slicing through the quiet, steady but filled with the ire I had kept bottled for so long. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" I locked eyes with him, a challenge coursing between us. Beneath his hardened expression, I could see the flicker of worry and something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. The SEALs stood still, a wall of discipline and respect behind me. This wasn't just about my father, this was about every young woman who had been told to step aside, about every moment I had fought to be seen. To me, this is where I belong. The silence hung heavy, filled with 10 years of unspoken arguments and tears. And then, in a twist I hadn't expected, the men around us began to stand, their posture straightening as they saluted. "The only easy day was yesterday," they shouted in unison. Their voices rang out like a battle cry, echoing around the hangar, blending with the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. For a brief moment, the room transformed. It was no longer just about my father's disapproval but a collective acknowledgement of the fight we all shared. I felt raw and alive, tears brimming as I glanced back at my father. At that moment, I realized something. His idea of who I was supposed to be had clashed with the reality of who I had become. I was not just a reflection of his expectations, I was a soldier fighting for my place in the world. I held my ground, my father's face a mix of disbelief and respect. It was a confrontation that I had needed, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand. I wasn't just here to validate my existence. I was here to assert it. I remember the day the Navy SEALs gathered on the base, their crisp uniforms a sharp contrast against the backdrop of the dusty training fields. The air was electric, thick with anticipation as they prepared to honor a fallen comrade. My heart sank as I watched my dad's face contort with a mixture of pride and worry, his eyes darting from the men in formation to me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low yet filled with authority. It was an instinctual response, a father's protective reflex. I couldn't help but feel the weight of his expectations, not just as a father but as a fellow service member. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a reminder of the risks we all accepted when we put on our uniforms. But as I stood there, resolute and ready, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Years of hard work, early mornings, and countless sacrifices washed over me like a tide pulling me closer to the shore. I had earned my place here, just as much as any of those SEALs. I was a gunnery sergeant, and I belonged in this battleground of respect and homage. There had been times when I doubted myself, when the whispers of inadequacy crept in, yet now I felt an unwavering resolve. I was not just an onlooker, I was part of this family shaped by duty and valor. As the ceremony progressed, I watched my dad's face soften, transitioning from apprehension to pride. The sight of those 200 Navy SEALs standing in formation, paying their respects, stirred something deep within me. Their sharp salutes echoed like a war cry, not just for the fallen, but for everyone who had ever donned a uniform. I felt an overwhelming sense of unity, a bond that surpassed the confines of rank and job title. My heart raced as I realized that my dad's initial instinctual reaction had morphed into a reluctant acceptance. He might not have understood the path I chose, but I saw the flicker of respect in his eyes, a glimmer of acknowledgement that I was not just a soldier but a part of this honored circle. After the last note of taps faded into the distance, I glanced at my dad. Our eyes met, an unspoken understanding lingering between us. The ceremony had been more than just a tribute, it was a mingling of our worlds, where the line between father and daughter blurred, giving way to something raw and real. I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the moment. He nodded at me, the familiar stoicism of his military upbringing softening just enough for me to see the underlying pride. I wanted to tell him about the missions and the comrades, the struggles and triumphs that defined my service, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I let the silence do the talking. Sometimes, words couldn't bridge the chasm of experience that separated us. As we walked away from the ceremony, surrounded by the camaraderie of my fellow Marines, I realized that the stakes were never just about the battles we fought externally but also the ones we waged within our families. My choice to serve had forged a path I couldn't change, but it was a path that had brought my dad and me to a deeper connection in that moment. I understood the complexities of duty and sacrifice now more than ever. I knew we would continue to navigate our differences, but today, I felt a sense of honor that we both shared in this life. My dad would still worry, but I had proven, even if only in small ways, that I was where I was meant to be, here, with him, and with my brothers and sisters in arms. The sun hung low, casting long shadows on the parade ground where I stood, a gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, as I prepared to deliver my final salute to the men and women who had stood beside me through every challenge. This day was not just a culmination of hard work but a proclamation of my identity, my worth, my strength, and my unwavering determination. For so long, I sought validation from those who believed that I didn't belong here, those who scoffed at my ambitions and called me a dreamer. Yet as I looked at the sea of uniforms, the glint of pride in their eyes, I felt an internal shift. I no longer needed their approval. I had fought for my place in this world, tooth and nail, and earned it. As the last of the ceremonies came to a close, the echoes of the only easy day was yesterday reverberated in my mind like a battle cry. It reminded me that every obstacle I faced, every doubter I encountered, had only fueled my fire. The image of my father's disapproving glare washed over me, his words still etched in my memory. "You shouldn't be here," he'd said, not realizing that his dismissal would only strengthen my resolve. I had learned that the weight of his expectations would not define me. Instead, my journey would be shaped by the trials I faced and the victories I claimed for myself. I chose to rise, not for him, but for me. Standing amongst my fellow warriors, I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, a kinship built not on blood, but on shared experience and mutual respect. We had trained together under agonizing conditions, we had bled together on the battlefield, and we had cried together in private moments of vulnerability. With each salute exchanged, I felt the barriers of doubt shatter, replaced by the conviction that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I looked at each face around me, some familiar, others new, and saw the reflections of our shared struggles. We were stitched together by our sacrifices. This was family, the kind that embraced not just the triumphs but also the scars that told our stories. Today marked a significant milestone, but it was not just about celebration, it was a testament to resilience. I had transformed from that uncertain young girl who sought her father's approval into a woman who stood tall with unwavering confidence. I remembered the countless nights spent training long after others had gone home, the stares from peers who thought I wouldn't last, and the moments I nearly turned back. Yet, I pressed on, fueled by the belief that I could redefine what it meant to be a woman in a man's world. Now, I embraced that identity, not just for myself, but for those who would follow in my footsteps, who might find inspiration in my journey. As I raised my hand in the final salute, sunlight caught the edges of my dress blues, creating a halo effect that felt almost surreal. It symbolized more than just an end, it embodied the triumph of my spirit over the doubts of others. I was not just a representation of strength, I was a beacon, illuminating the path for those who dared to dream bigger than what society prescribed. The horizon danced with possibilities, and I stood firmly at its edge, prepared to take the leap into whatever awaited. In that moment, I was free, and my heart swelled with pride, knowing I would face the future unshackled by anyone's expectations. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from.